and welcome back. Right now, let us play this.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. May, when much to my surprise, a pair of bunny eyes. Do-do-do-do-do. Boy, is this a neat way to travel. Isn't it great? Dum-da-dum-dum-dum. Dum-da-dum-dum-dum.
So, what you just heard there was one of the last recordings taken during the Apollo missions of man being man on the moon. Essentially, it's just the same joyfulness that we've been expressing since a million years ago when we found things to laugh at before we even had language, all the way till today when we have the technology to go to other heavenly bodies and skip around on the moon and sing silly songs with one another. That's essentially what being human and traveling to space is about.
It's amazing to listen to those voices so happy, like so far away. I mean, it kind of is a shock to me, to be honest. I know that that first moon mission was fraught with danger and fear as well as all of that promise. But to hear them so happy, like in that last mission, honestly, that's a joy to listen to. Welcome back, Alan. Good to good to hear from you, and good to get cracking on this next episode. We're going to
good to be back, Johan.
Thank you so much. What are we going to be talking about today? That was obviously a clip from the moon. What are we going to be covering?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to get into was just kind of the history of what brought us to where we are today and why that history actually came about.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a clip from Apollo 17. So there was 17 lunar missions, and if I'm not mistaken, there was 9 of them that were actually manned and landed on the surface. So why would we need to go back to the moon, or would we need to go to the moon in the first place, all the way back then?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I was going to say, we sent, as you said, 17 missions up there, and 9 of them were manned, which is kind of astonishing. And that's a huge amount of expenditure, and over quite a considerable period of time. And when we came back, like that was, I think, in the 1970s. And honestly,
Yeah.
It's like 2020 now, right? So we're into the third decade of the 21st century, and we haven't been back to the moon in almost 40, between 40 and 50 years. So
Yeah, it's been half a century now.
yeah. So I mean, first of all, why haven't we been back to the moon?
For the reasons that they shut the Apollo program down, essentially it was just we were spending a lot of money and learning a lot of the same stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We had set a goal: get to the moon, bring rocks back, bring men back, plant a flag, and we achieved that goal. And when we got done with it, we didn't have our next goal. We didn't have our next step. We didn't have the technology to even accomplish the next step if we had even set that step. And so, essentially, we just haven't had a need to go back to space because there's been plenty of room and resources to grow down here on Earth.
Wow. And again, I think it's kind of strange to think about this, but we landed on the moon in 1969, but a lot of the missions were unmanned, right? And were flown to the moon, I think, in part to prove that certain technology worked, and also that we could actually get there, which are two slightly different things. And they started going to the moon essentially in 1961, right?
Right. 1961 is when the Apollo program started,
Okay.
and it actually ended in 1975. So it was really just a really short period and brief period of human history that we were actually actively trying to go to another celestial body. And the fact that we accomplished it with such little technology and such little information about what was actually out there was a monumental achievement. And the drive that we had back then that we don't seem to have today in the public opinion really spurred from the Cold War and the fact that we were at war with another nation. And one of the goals and achievements of that war, to help it not be an active fight, was the space race.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was reading up about it in history that it was the Soviets actually that put the first satellite up into space. I think it was Sputnik, right? And I think that galvanized a lot of people who looked over and went, "Hold on, if we don't get our bootlaces tied and get actually running, we're going to be left behind. These people are going to control not just the skies but everything beyond." And so, yeah, go ahead.
The public opinion there at the time was, we thought we were neck and neck with the Soviets, and we weren't really too enthusiastic about pushing any harder because we didn't really have a drive to do it. But then when Sputnik launched and actually got into orbit around Earth, our government saw that as so what Sputnik was, it was essentially just communications equipment inside of a shell that was in orbit around Earth. But what our government saw was the potential to put a bomb or a weapon of some sort in that shell and replace the communications equipment. And now the Soviets have us beat. And so to galvanize that enthusiasm in the public, they essentially pointed out to the American people and the free world that slaves being weighed down with chains had outran them and outpaced them to space. And that just absolutely would not settle with the free world. And it's really what gave us our drive and the real fuel that we needed to fuel the fire to go to space.
Yeah, and the context for it was very interesting. I mean, you had not just the space race, which we were talking about, which was about to kick off, but before that, you had the Cold War, which, I mean, I know some of our viewers are a bit younger than others, who they may not be familiar with it, but for the largest part in the last century, you had America and, the West, NATO face off against the Soviet empire, effectively, right? And these were two adversaries, superpowers, who had gigantic nuclear stocks, were fighting proxy wars, which we called them Cold Wars because obviously a hot war would have involved, huge armies moving across the and annihilation. Yeah, I was trying to lead up to annihilation, but you were like, "Let's go, yeah, let's go, baby! It's annihilation time." Yeah, and that was
that's
insane.
Exactly how it would have been.
Yeah,
you don't go for manned warfare against giant powers that can rival you on a battlefield. You just wipe them out. Yeah, so that's why the war essentially had to stay cold.
Yeah,
and for the sake of humanity.
But then you had all this tech that was being built, right? We had rocketry from the end of the Second World War, right? We had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had happened around that time, actually, right? And you also had ICBMs, right, which were intercontinental ballistic missiles, which is exactly what they say on the tin, right? You had these missiles which were able to span continents, and then suddenly you had Sputnik up in the air. And for the first time, you had this gigantic political coup, right? But which wasn't escalating the military tensions. And I think when the Russians proved that they could get a satellite into space, into orbit, and they could communicate, etc., the Americans went, hold on a second. Our tech is better than your tech. We can do a lot more. And if you're going to try and stake a claim over everything that's above us, that's not something we're going to let stand, right?
Right. And Sputnik was the starting point for all of this, and that's where Americans really took notice. But we really didn't get our fire underneath us until the Soviets put the first man into space. And that's when we realized that we were falling behind, and we had the superior technology, but we just weren't utilizing it in the correct way to help us forward our society.
Yuri Gagarin, if I remember correctly.
Yes, Yuri Gagarin, an absolute hero worldwide for all of humanity.
Yes. But obviously somewhat terrifying for the American scientific establishment, right?
It was horrifically good in the best way possible.
I gotta love your sense of humor, man. So, okay. I mean, we had the Cold War, and we had this, giant setup, and then, what really kicked off what kicked off the space race? I remember Kennedy was in charge at the time, right?
Yeah. So with Kennedy, it was just a one-up kind of war, but the space race wasn't the number one priority of his, but it was just influencing the rest of the world and influencing the American people in a positive manner that didn't result in global annihilation at the time. And that's what he was really trying to avoid. And the space race was a perfect opportunity to prove concepts that we had been theorizing on for a while and learn science, real, honest to God, hard science, not just theories that we could test, all the while showing up our rivals on the battlefield without firing a single weapon.
I think that was one of the things, like he made a speech, a very famous one, where he talked about, a commitment that within 10 years they were going to put, a man on the moon. And I think that galvanized a whole bunch of industries across America, and also I think the spirit of that nation. I mean, it was one of the defining moments, actually, that existed, right?
Right. If you had been a wealthy person at the time, and you heard your president say something like that in a time of absolute despair, because we were facing the barrels of a gun from around the world at all times, so people were really scared at the time, and you hear your nation's leader say something like that, it gives you a place that you can put your money and know that your government and every person around you standing shoulder to shoulder with one another, trying to put all their efforts and energy into one field. You know you're going to make money in it. You know you're going to be doing good for your country, and you know you're going to be doing good for the entirety of humanity. It was an absolutely phenomenal time to be alive when the actual space race started.
And it was also a proof of concept, as you were saying, of a lot of those different technologies, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, like you were pointing out, we had intercontinental ballistic, which essentially just flies up and goes out of the atmosphere and then goes over to whatever continent it needs to get to. And so we knew we could get out of the atmosphere, but that didn't tell us anything about whether or not we, like a human or an animal, could live when it was in space. We didn't know if there was huge amounts of radiation. We didn't know if it was super hot or super cold. Or like, we had theories about all of this stuff, but we really didn't know. There was no way to know until you actually went up there and started testing this kind of stuff. And the space race opened up the essentially the pocketbooks to be able to fund the kind of initiatives that we would need to find out this information. So the proof of concepts that were proven at that time and during the space race, the early days of the space technologies, really set the stage for what was going to be humanity's jump off into the cosmos, which we're seeing today.
So, aside from being a proof of concept, you also had a lot of the scientific sort of benefits as well from it as well, right? What were the kind of scientific benefits that we were concretely going to get? I mean, as well as proving that our missile technology worked and we could build rockets and we could do that. What were the key things that we thought we were going to get out of it?
Well, I can't tell you anything that was concrete at the time, but the things that we did end up getting out of it was better engines, better understanding of the space weather at the time, better understanding of the impact of the harsh environment of space on certain technologies and biological life. So those sciences and even certain medicines and things have been developed in space, but that's more of the ISS. So just at the time, we were just kind of dropping things into the new murky liquid that we found and seeing if they dissolve or not. It was really a just trial by fire kind of way of going about it, but we did learn so many new and interesting things that we had no way of knowing before then.
It was the first time in human history where you had people that were actually orbiting over the Earth and were able to see the sun rise and set like in a few days, that they could actually look down on it with a decent amount of time, that they could send these things not just like into orbit around us reliably, but also I think towards the moon. The fact that we were able to say send something around the moon and come back, I remember that was something that was a highlight, and it showed that yes, the moon is within reach. We haven't touched it yet, we haven't landed on it yet, but we can do it, and they did it several times as well. It was astonishing.
Oh yeah, it was one of the scariest things when the very first few humans went behind the moon, on the dark side of the moon, that had never been seen by human eyes before. And so we completely lost communication with those astronauts on that side of the moon. And until they arrived out the other side, we had no idea what was happening to them. We didn't know if they encountered aliens on the other side or saw a really big telescope or just a big smiley face painted on the backside of it. Honestly, there was an equal opportunity of anything going on at the time, because it was all new. It was honest to God exploration at its finest.
And even to this day, we still have that metaphor, that fear of what happens when you're on the dark side of the moon. It still exists. It's a core part of our language. It literally means that you're on your own, right? So that moment, like when the whole of humanity, not just the Americans, but the whole of humanity held their breath to see if those people came out from the other side, that was astonishing.
Absolutely. So
wow. So
there's lots of interesting things.
Okay. So I mean, what did we learn? You mentioned that we learned that we can live in space, right?
Yeah. That was honestly one of the biggest things. Just the fact that we found out that the radiation could be shielded against, and that we could travel in the cosmos as biological creatures. That was one of the most beneficial things we've learned. Because if that hadn't been the case, if we had gone up there and just been instantly bathed in gamma radiation, there'd be no way for us to get off Earth, and we would have had to change our priorities from expanding into the cosmos to figuring out how to make our home last as long as possible. And we still have to do that, but we have so many more options now that we know that we can, as a species, travel throughout the cosmos.
Yeah, that was astonishing. What other stuff did we learn, actually? Because there's a ton of stuff that I'm thinking that we got out of it that maybe people don't realize.
Yeah, so we got engine technologies, different higher thrust to weight ratio engines that, like the Saturn V. Is that the name of the rocket that we took to the moon?
Yeah,
I'm drawing a blank.
Yes, it was the Saturn rockets that effectively did it, and these things were terrifying. I've seen pictures of them. Right, they're basically skyscrapers, and essentially.
Oh no, it's not basically a skyscraper. It is, by all accounts, an honest-to-God skyscraper with a controlled explosion, a directional explosion on one end of it. And it is still, to this day, the most powerful rocket ever built. And it was all built with very little computer input.
Well, they built those things to last.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're like, yep, we really don't want to have egg on our face and have people get, sort of into, it's one of those things. These were very, very, very public endeavors, right? If these things blew up, if these things failed, if there was a problem, it wasn't just a problem for the program, it was a problem for the United States, and it was a problem for NATO. So, it was insane. Right. It wasn't just like that we learned about those things, but we also, once we were up there and looking at Earth and the Moon, we also learned a lot about the solar system. Isn't that right?
I can't honestly speak on that. I'm not fully aware of the accomplishments from learning about the solar system at that time. Do you know anything?
Yeah. So one of the things that we learned was that there actually are, for example, different points that we were traveling, that when we're traveling, say, from Earth, right, to the Moon, that gravity affects you quite differently as you're going through it, right? So the different sort of thrust and ratios that you needed in order to actually maintain course gave us a lot of information as to what the gravimetric topology of space was. So we thought the midpoint of gravity, right, which is different from the spatial midpoint. It's a point at which gravity between the Moon and the Earth, was going to be at one particular point, but we actually found that it was slightly further than we imagined. And it turned out that that was because of the composition of the Moon itself, which was actually different from what we thought, just from visual observation. When we got to the other side of the Moon for the first time, you could see, the entire sort of solar system without having anything, behind you that was able to, interfere with it. So there were large parts of the solar system that we were able to get visual readings on, and that was a huge deal for us because we could make observations of, say, Jupiter and Mars and Saturn, and do that from a vantage point that wasn't on Earth and filtered by the atmosphere. Imagine being able to get clear of all of that stuff, right? Being able to see as far as the eye could actually see, get all of those readings, get all of those recordings, and then come back and compare them with the kind of charts that we had and what we expected to see. And we found a whole class of new objects out there, at the very far edges of the solar system, which told us a lot more about how it was formed. Like, we understood the asteroid belts a lot better, right? And just by getting out of the, atmosphere of Earth and actually being up there. It was interesting. We also found that there were a lot more, for example, near-Earth asteroids than we imagined. Because, when you're here, you're looking up towards the Moon, it seems pretty clear. It turns out there's a whole class of bodies that kind of orbit the Sun roughly close to the orbit that the Earth has, right? And they kind of graze past where we go. That's not a big deal if you're on Earth, right? But it's a very big deal if you're up and trying to land people on the Moon. You do not want to, accidentally plot a course that ends up, being affected by one of these asteroids. And so the fact that these asteroids existed told us a lot more about how the asteroid belt formed, what kind of debris was left over, and also what the original composition was of the rocky plants that made up the center of the solar system. Those are just a couple of things that come to mind. I'm sorry if I didn't mean to monologue. Please go ahead.
No, you're good. You're just talking about all the payoff that we actually got for going into space. A lot of the science and technologies that came from that have, if you do the math, have essentially paid for the entire endeavor time and time again,
yes,
based on their economic impact down here on Earth over the period of time that we've been able to use them and utilize them for other things than the space race. And so all of this is technically profitable in the long run, if you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty details. But the biggest payoff for actually going to the Moon, picking up a few rocks, taking some surface samples and planting a flag and then coming home was winning the space race. We have to be very honest about this. We were at war, and by doing it, we won.
There's a reason why we planted the American flag on the surface of the moon. Even though the treaties and everything else that we signed, back on Earth, said to everybody else, it's not for America, we do this for the world. And that was the diplomatic thing to do, right? Because you didn't want to exacerbate tensions. It was a gigantic symbol of American power and promise and hope for the species. When Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, right? He was an American person that landed on the moon. It was American technology, and it was capitalism that did all of that. And when they planted the actual flag on the moon, it was everything short of claiming the moon for America and for the free world and for capitalism. They were very careful to couch the language in a way that included everybody, because it was incredibly humble of them, it was incredibly decent of them, and it's something that I think we should all be very grateful for, because it was a moment of pure unselfishness and recognition that this wasn't an achievement for one particular nation or one particular tribe. It was something for the whole world, but it was a gigantic thing that it was Americans that did that, and not the Russians or the Soviets, right? And it proved to the world that there were things that you could achieve if you went down one particular road and one particular open culture that you wouldn't get if you went down a closed one. And
Right. And a bit of a funnier fact that had been classified for years and years until recently when it was opened up. So we didn't, like you said earlier, we didn't know the composition of the moon, and we definitely didn't know what the surface was going to be like. Mm-hmm. So for all we know, for all we knew, it could have been just lunar dust for 20 feet down that acted like quicksand. And that's why the lunar lander module feet were extremely wide, because we wanted to get as much surface area as possible just in case. And when Neil Armstrong climbed down the ladder and took his first step out, we really didn't know if he was just going to sink all the way through and we wouldn't be able to get him out. It was terrifying.
One small step for man. Yep. One final leap for mankind.
But so they wouldn't let them go very far away from the lander. It was just a few yards. And because of that, when they planted the flag, they had to plant it really close to the actual ascent module. And when they took off in the ascent module, the burst of gas that came from that as its exhaust actually blew the flag over and covered it with dust. So the moment they left, and there is a video of it when they take off, one of the astronauts was looking out the window and he's like, uh-oh, because it shows it fall over.
Shall we go back? Nah, it'll be fine.
Well, see, that's the reason why we actually had to keep it classified, because if the American public had known that our flag had fallen over on the moon, there would have been an absolute uproar to go back to that spot simply to turn the flag back up. Actually,
I mean, it's also one of those things that feeds into the conspiracy theories. But let's skip past that. Actually, I mean, we've covered a lot of stuff about
one more thing before we go on. You quoted it, and I cringed a little bit.
Absolutely.
So Neil Armstrong's line when he was stepping off the lunar module is actually one of the most misquoted quotes in the world, because it's not that's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. It was, and that is one small step for a man and one giant leap for mankind, because he is just a man and he's taking one step. But if you listen to the audio, you can actually hear it, and it gets garbled just a little bit when he says "a," and that's why people mishear it.
Yeah. I did not know that. Thank you so much.
Okay. Because
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going
to go ahead.
Thank you so much. So, like, I think we've covered, like, the Cold War stuff. We've covered, like, what we wanted to try and get out of it. We definitely, I think, like, touched on what we got out of it. What I'm interested in talking about, and I think you might be interested as well, is actually what are we going to do to get back to the moon? Because, as you said, it's been 50 years. What's going on?
Yeah, it's been 50 years since we've gone to the moon, and our technology has severely been upgraded over the time. And the amount of money that we put into these projects is just phenomenally more. So why haven't we gone back? What are we doing? We have a new reason to go back, and that is what we are doing. In the next 5 to 10 years, there will be boots on the ground again, but instead of scientific boots, this time it will be prospectors. So here recently, we have discovered that there is water ice on the polar caps of the moon inside craters that the way their rims are shaped in relevance to the sun, relative to the sun, they never receive light at the bottom of them. So ice water can stay ice water without breaking down from the solar winds forever.
So where does that water originally come from? Is it from inside the moon? Is it from, is there something going on inside the craters? Or is it like, asteroids which have ice in them?
It's asteroids over time that cause those impacts. Just the way they hit, the way they spread out, the way they coagulated, I guess, to the bottom of these craters. They've essentially been there since they hit the moon. And that's just, it makes it ancient water that'll be very interesting to research. But it's not water that came from the Earth, and that's for certain. So it'll be, if we do get there and melt a bit of it and use it inside the modules that we will have down there and drink it, those will be the very first biological life forms to ever drink that water.
Well, let's hope it tastes good,
I'm sure it will taste very clean and unused.
Yeah, so, okay, we've got a new project going out, and I know the last project was like Apollo. What's this one called?
Yeah, so this one is going to be the Artemis mission. Artemis is the sister goddess to Apollo, and she's the goddess of the hunt and the moon. So it's very fitting that we would name it Artemis to go back to the moon. And on the first actual manned landing during the Artemis program, they're planning on having the first man back in 50 years and the very first woman to ever walk on the surface of the moon.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's 2020 after all. You'd hope that, it's a bit more of a diverse crowd that goes up there.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, do you have a timeline for when we're going to be putting stuff up on the moon or anything like that? Or is it just in the initial stages? Where are we at with it?
Yeah, we've right now the price tag we're looking at is about $30 billion, and that's, 30 billion sounds like a lot to you and I, but that's just a fraction of the military's budget every year. So we're going to be able to put that money towards building the Gateway, which is a lunar kind of staging point that will be in orbit around the moon in a elliptical orbit, so the astronauts will have a place to stay. That's part of the mission. But then in 2021, the first CubeSats will be put into translunar injection, so that we'll have somewhat of a communications array set up before we get there. And I think it's 2023. We're planning the first manned mission around the moon, so that'll be the first person back behind on the dark side of the moon.
Yeah.
For the last 50 years.
So before we go any further, I'm thinking of CubeSats. Are they going to be orbiting like the moon, or are they going to be, orbiting, I guess what I'm saying is, it sounds like they're going to be orbiting the moon, right? And it sounds like it's going to be a communications array. I think I understand that. I think we talked on the Starlink project. We touched on it like last time, right?
Yeah.
Are they sending signals to a relay station on the moon, or are they, and is that going to beam it, the signal
They
back towards Earth, or are they going to talk directly back to Earth? How's that going to work?
yeah. So with CubeSats, you can think of it as one or a whole bunch of little satellites acting as one big sat.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as one of them has direct line of sight contact with back home, it also has contact with other ones that don't have line of sight back home. So they can work in series and as kind of repeaters. And from what I understand, they're going to be put into orbit around the moon so that we have a communications array in place so that no matter where we are, even if it is on the side of the moon, we'll have communication back home and direct access to modules that we put into orbit.
And the delay from like the Earth to the moon is relatively trivial. Like it's only a couple of seconds of lag or something like that.
Oh yeah, it would essentially be like talking between you and I right now.
Okay, so awkward then, but not too bad.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Okay.
almost unnoticeable. You should be able to have like a face-to-face Skype kind of conversation with people in lunar
Wow.
orbit.
That would be phenomenal, and that's going to happen in like next year, basically, is what you're saying.
That's 2021. 2023 will be the first man around the moon, and then
Wow.
2024 will be the first person on the moon. But these deadlines, it's NASA that put them in place, and they keep on getting pushed back. And I
Oh,
mean, that's generally what happens with NASA.
so essentially, if all things are equal, then we should have another, person landing on the moon in what, like 4 or 5 years. But I think it's fair to say that we've got COVID, which came out of the blue. So I don't know if, yeah, I think it's probably likely to expect a little bit of a delay, but hopefully, we can find out and make sure that, we keep tabs on it because I definitely want to see that happen, right?
Yeah. COVID shouldn't. I mean, with infrastructure being dampened down here on Earth, that can slow down the process a little bit. But most of the stuff that we're doing is remote and
Hmm.
easily converted into the post-COVID kind of world now, because a lot of things can be done on computer and through communications rather than in person.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting things about space technology is that it is effectively COVID proof, right? Because, we check everything and triple check it and check it 100 times and make sure that there's no possibility that somebody who's going up there is going to have any kind of like disease or, communicable sort of, issue. Because frankly, we don't want to have to deal with it, when you're stuck in a tin can floating in the middle of like nowhere, right?
Yeah, I wish I could say that, but we're a lot stronger now than we were. But even during the Apollo kind of era, um, I think there was something brought back. I can't remember exactly what piece of technology
Mm.
it was, but it was brought back from the moon. And when we disassembled it to take the readings from inside, they found some weird goo growing inside of it, and they kind of did a biological test, and they realized it was biological, and it turned out to be somebody's snot from where they had sneezed, and snot had gotten into the internals of the part. But
Oh, yuck. That's horrible.
yeah,
That's actually
yeah,
terrible.
absolutely.
Thanks, man. Okay,
So
okay.
as long as we are a bit more strenuous with regulation now, then yes, we're fine. But yeah,
All right. So we were talking, I think, before we got sidetracked around that too. We were talking about like something very interesting, actually. The ice water, at the poles, and I think we know where that comes from. But there are obviously like other things as well. Like if we put people back on or around the moon, and we're starting to put infrastructure up there, are we not just like making it easier for ourselves? Because these CubeSats, I imagine, are going to still spin around the moon, and you're talking about putting what is effectively another international space station around the moon, if I'm right.
yeah, it's a lot smaller than the International Space Station. where the International Space Station is fairly certain it's the equivalent of like a 6-bedroom house. This is going to be like a small studio apartment kind of thing.
Ooh.
But yeah, it's a lot smaller, but it gives us a jumping off point and a staging point for moving materials around in space a lot cheaper. And the ice water is actually important not because it's water, but because that is nice. I mean, it's oxygen and it's water for habitation. But what's really important there is the hydrogen and oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
Those are two crucial parts of very efficient rocket engines that we can use to get to places like Mars or the asteroid belt or Venus or anywhere we really want to go.
So we get fuel basically by going to the moon.
Yeah, it's fuel that's not inside the gravitational well of Earth. So we don't have to bring it up. We just have to bring it closer to Earth to put it into ships or take it to the Lunar Gateway and process it into fuel by heating and then electrolysis.
Lunar Gateway, is that the name for the space station, or is that the name for the entire project?
Lunar Gateway is it's the secondary project that comes from the Artemis project. The Artemis missions give us the Gateway. The Gateway is a critical infrastructure piece that has to be put into place for Artemis to be completed.
Is the space station around the moon named yet, or is it just going to be like the lunar space station? Is that what we're going to call it?
As of right now, the name is the Gateway.
Okay, cool.
Because they do intend for it to be the gateway to the rest of the solar system.
That's amazing. So we launch, so we can get fuel. We can definitely have this gateway, which will allow us to be able to launch and use as a launching pad, I think, for the rest of the solar system. I mean, obviously, as you said, this is the thing that intrigues me the most. The people that we're sending up there are definitely going to be scientists, but they're essentially going to be the kind of scientists that are prospectors, right? So it reminds me a little bit of the Wild West. What are they looking for? Gold or something else?
Preferably aluminum, carbon, and water.
So resources,
Those are
right?
the two. Yeah, resources are the main things that we're looking for. Rare earth materials will be sought after, but not in as much quantity as you would expect. Because in outer space, they're not rare earth because we're not on the Earth. You can essentially go out and get an asteroid full of aluminum, and it just so happens to have quite a bit of gold and quite a bit of other things that you would want inside of it as well.
So the moon, does it have aluminum or aluminium, as we who speak English call it, inside the moon itself? Look, we can start a Cold War on that some other time. But essentially, is that metal, which shall furthermore be unnamed, is that actually in the moon itself, or is it just around the moon? I mean, whereabouts would it be?
I'm certain it's going to be on the moon. There's lots of minerals on the moon and lots of metals on the moon that are critical for us building the infrastructure and the ships that we're actually wanting to build in outer space rather than down here on the ground. Mm-hmm. They're all on the moon, but an easier way to go about that is to use the moon as a staging ground to go and get asteroids that are already outside of even Luna's small gravitational well. But with the moon, those materials that we'd be gathering there on the ground, such as aluminium and carbon and steel or iron for making steel and such, would go into projects to build lunar infrastructure to help us get more of that stuff and then eventually get that stuff into orbit around the moon, which is significantly easier than it is down here on Earth.
So, okay. We've got fuel. Pardon me. We're able to have the space station up there, which is effectively part of the Gateway project to the rest of the solar system. We've talked about the resources as well that are there. And getting those resources sounds to me to be amazing because it's going to be the first time that we're going to be able to mine stuff that's actually off the atmosphere of Earth, right? And it'll be
Correct.
effectively stuff that takes or reduces the amount of scarcity that we have on Earth, right? So for like if we bring back a lot of aluminium or aluminum in towards, I guess what I'm asking is, how do we get it back from the moon to Earth?
Uh, Bundle it up in aerogel wrapping and hurl it at the Earth so it lands in the desert or the sea.
Okay.
It's really once you have it in orbit up there, and if you do need to get it back down to gravity, it's really easy. You just kind of push it in the direction it goes where you want it to go, but you're not fighting against the current anymore. You're just going with it. But that opens the door for, like you said, a lowering of the scarcity on the ground, so that the economy that would be built from this would be so enticing and so rich and available to everybody that is part of this project that it would essentially wipe out all aggression down here on the ground between anybody that wants to be part of this project and wants to be part of this economy.
I mean, I'm just...
anybody...
Sorry, go on.
But anybody who isn't part of this economy going forward, they might survive for a while, but eventually they're just going to be completely outcompeted by the sheer number of resources that the nations that are part of this economy would have at their fingertips.
I'm just thinking, like, from the point of view of someone that's unlikely to ever actually step foot on another planetary body, just how wonderful it would be to see the start of the end of like strip mining of Earth's resources, you know, or the fear that, you know, you have to like carve up large sections of, you know, these things are scars on the face of the Earth. They give us a lot more than we put in. Obviously, we do it for that reason, but if we could obviously get the stuff from somewhere else, it just makes our life a lot better here. You know, we can reduce the damage that we do to the environment. The impact is going to be huge for us, and I think if we are able to even start doing a lot of this manufacturing and this work above the sky, I mean, that just means that we have fewer factories to build here, you know, fewer things which will actually pump carbon into the air. I'm seeing a lot of benefits actually from even just I know it won't happen overnight. This is the same thing with everything else, and we obviously have to temper whatever we're talking about with a great deal of caution. But I think you're right. Like that ability to add resources to the Earth's ecosystem for the first time, rather than having to churn through and burn through and try and extract and then recycle all of that stuff. Like that sounds very promising.
Absolutely. So the impact of a change like this is the equivalent of the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the world. It completely changes it doesn't just change the size and shape of the playing field, it changes the location and the rules of the game. It's something that will completely redefine who we are as a species, and the politics and the economy and the society that is involved in this is going to be completely different coming out the other side. Something much better, much more understanding, and many more abilities than we do today.
So if we have water on the moon, right, and we have the ability to, say, land people on the moon, and we're obviously going to start to mine these things, I'm imagining that we're going to start to have bases on the actual moon itself, right?
Yeah.
And how, I mean, I know it sounds silly, I'm just a romantic, but are these going to be giant things like that are going to be visible from Earth, or are they just going to be small scale stuff and we're going to use resources from elsewhere? What do you think?
For lunar infrastructure, the first places we'll be going are what are they called? magma tunnels
Mm-hmm.
or lava tunnels, something like that. It's so at one time, Luna's mantle was very active, and it did appear to have something like volcanoes on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And so that suggests to us that there are lava tubes, yeah, that's what they're called, lava tubes underneath the surface, which can stretch for kilometers and kilometers. And so that's already a pre-made, pre-sealed facility that you just got to cap the front of it and cap wherever you want the back of it to be, and then pump it full of oxygen. And that's going to be where the first settlements are, because that gives you radiation proofing, that gives you a huge area which to live in, and lots of room for infrastructure, but mostly under the surface.
So I've got a question. I mean, we know that microgravity over a period of say a year or 2 years has definite impact on the human body, and one of the advantages of the moon is that it does have a very low gravity. If we're inside these tubes and we're kind of floating around, how long can we reasonably stay there before we start to see a deterioration that's going to become a problem?
Uh, Technically, it's within the first few weeks that you start seeing bone and muscle atrophy in 0 Gs. So even on the trip over there, you're going to start seeing the effects of low Gs. And Luna's gravity is actually only 16% that of which Earth is.
Yeah.
And so even the astronauts at the time, when we did visit the planet, they had extreme difficulty walking around and balancing in the lunar gravity, because once you get yourself walking in a certain direction, it's a bit easier to stay on your feet, but trying to stop, the momentum of your head moving forward can just barely be stopped by your feet unless you make your body almost completely 45 degrees so that energy is dissipated. It's nothing like living down here on Earth. So you're going to have either simulated gravity on the moon so that you can continue to live there for long periods of time, or some sort of medical technology that can stimulate the muscles at night, or like while you're sleeping they actively contract your muscles so that they'll continue to grow and continue to strengthen while you're on the moon, or stay at the steady strength that they are. Or it's just going to have to be short jaunts to the moon and then come back for a time. So there's a lot of infrastructural and biological hurdles that we have to get over just to get there.
And even once we are there, we need to obviously be able, I mean, these lava tubes sound very promising, but I guess they're not going to be very easy to be able to simulate gravity, inside them, unless we actually, put in a bit of extra effort, and find some way of doing that, right?
From my understanding, if you were to build a the idea for the centripetal rings or stations that we want to put in space to simulate gravity, you could essentially do that inside of the lava tube, and just at a large enough scale, and spin that. And if the bottom of it is equal to Earth gravity, and the top of it would be minus 16%. So 84% Earth gravity. So standing inside of a ring like that, going around in circles, would be like the equivalent of being on very choppy seas in the ocean during a storm. So it wouldn't be pleasant, but it would be some sort of gravity that you could get used to and put yourself through to give you that little bit of strain on your body. So there is stuff that we can do to counteract it. It's just not very effective.
I think this sounds like it's going to be a set of missions initially, which makes a lot of sense. And I think, once we have that infrastructure in place, then obviously we can start to, reap the benefits of it once we solve those problems. And we don't have to solve everything, I think, on day one. Rome as they say, was not built in a day. But let's talk about the implications of the project once it's completed and successful. It sounds like there are going to be new jobs, not just in the sky, but also, or I mean, on the moon, but also like in terms of the space station, in terms of, sort of NASA and that stuff here. But from what I'm hearing from you, and I think it makes a lot of sense, when these resources come back down to Earth, there's going to be a whole slew of new jobs in this new economy, right?
Absolutely. So one of the big things is that NASA, you are correct in saying that it's going to take a lot of launches to actually get all this stuff up there so that we can start all this. Well, NASA isn't doing it by itself. They're employing the help of private enterprises to fly a lot of their infrastructure to the moon for them, but normally not the people is the direction they're kind of leaning in. So businesses like SpaceX or Blue Origin are trying to get in and build a economic infrastructure down here on Earth to employ people, to give them jobs doing certain tasks that go hand in hand with all of these operations. And then with that material coming back to Earth, that material would be coming back to Earth as private property, essentially, because it's mined in orbit or mined out on the moon and then brought back to Earth in the same way that a semi-truck would bring a load of copper out of a mine into a facility to be melted. So that stuff would all have to be processed and all have to be turned into reasonable and usable goods down here on Earth. And just the huge influx of what we consider rare earth materials down here to the surface would completely change the scope of what is possible for infrastructure right now.
So a lot of the larger mining concerns would do very well out of it. Obviously, manufacturing would do extremely well out of it. Yes, okay, you may not get rare earth materials initially, but those would definitely be on the cards later on. So we're talking not just an impact on, direct construction, fabrication of certain metal devices, but we're also talking in terms of like electronic devices as well, right? Generally technology across the board. And I think we talked last time about lithium and, having, the potential to have like some sort of base up there that'll actually work. What I love about this particular episode, I want to say this, right, is that when we were talking in the last episode, right, where we were discussing like what we could do, a lot of it was very speculative. Nothing about this stuff, i.e. the Artemis project, from our point of view is speculative. This is stuff that's actually coming to us directly from NASA. They are going to do this, they are going to do that, but I don't think, and I am very grateful to you for this, most of our audience were aware of just what the scope of it is and what that means for us and how promising that is, and also, frankly, how close that is, right? A lot of what we've done in COVID time has been, I think, shrunk in on ourselves, sit at home and worry about the fact that the economy is going to fail, and the fact that there are these projects ongoing and that they're effectively, clear of a lot of the problems of COVID in the first place, and that they have the ability to be game changers. Like, that's going to give a lot of people that listen to this hope. I really am grateful to you for bringing this up, and I honestly didn't know a lot of this stuff before you talked about it just now. So thank you, sir.
Yeah, that is one of the amazing things about this episode. This is not something we're just making up or talking about. Could be a good thing to happen. This is something that people will see in the next decade, and it will happen, and it will be reality. It'll no longer be science fiction; it'll be science fact. And to see things like that, like this, come to fruition within my lifetime is just absolutely amazing. And to think what we will be doing after gaining all of these resources and infrastructure, our abilities are just tenfold times what they were before we have just one piece of technology up there. And every time we add a new one, it just multiplies it by an entirely new factor.
Yeah. Wow. So, okay. Are there any other benefits that you think we should cover off? Like, you know, in terms of, because we've covered the economic benefits, right? And
Yeah.
we've covered, I think, the fact that there are going to be like different jobs. Um, I mean,
And
what's
so
left?
the technological impact from all of this, so during the space race, and then later on during the shuttle program when we were building the ISS, the technologies that came from that, like the digital camera or rocketry engines or um, oxygen scrubbing machines, different things, different technologies that were used for space, eventually percolated down into modern day society, where we use the same technology for for different things, and that's going to happen no matter what we do. Every time we run into crazy and unusual and new problems, um, what is it that they say? The mother of invention is
Necessity is the
necessity.
mother. Yeah, necessity is
Yeah,
definitely one of the mothers of
yeah.
invention.
And right. So, and when we get to space and we encounter new problems, like how do we experience gravity when we're in low G's? Um, when we have new questions like that have to be answered, they will be answered. The engineers will come up with something. And 90% of the time, that technology has another use down here on Earth that we hadn't thought of yet because it wasn't a problem for us.
Or
And
even further out into space as well. Like like the simulating gravity problem, right, is a big issue. And even if they don't solve it in that particular way, or they do solve it, or they optimize it, that's going to be huge for us. Because if they solve it for the moon, we can use it throughout the solar system, right? And even if they don't, and we find some other way of, maintaining muscle mass and addressing those issues, those are real challenges that we are going to have to face if we're going to be a spacefaring species. Sooner or later we're going to have to be able to find a way to solve those problems, either by generating those kinds of artificial gravities or by strengthening the human, frame. And yeah, like
right,
that's just a touch of the just touching on the stuff that we talked about. Like as you say, better technology is going to be a huge boon to us.
right. And then the repercussions of that down here on the Earth are just what's going to be very interesting to see the new markets and the new economies uh,
What kind of markets
popping
do
up
what
after.
what kind of markets do you anticipate, and what kind of economies do you think will pop up?
So I can see um, a huge boom in automation.
Hmm.
Um, so to build facilities and things like this on the, you don't have a bunch of people there, but you do have materials to make infrastructure. So self-replicating robots or just even mining machines that are autonomous by themselves. You're going to see a lot more things like that popping up in space. But then all of that has wonderful uses back here on the ground, where companies can use that to lower the cost of materials coming up out of the ground, and therefore lower the cost of materials that are actually hitting the shelves. And
Mm.
so that's definitely going to be one of the things that we see come from this. The robotics industry is going to get a big boom. Um, I don't know. There's so many speculative markets that could open up because of new technologies being created for uh, outer space use. Just it's almost uncalculable. I imagine after it's all built and we're looking back, it'll seem very obvious what the candidates and what the choices were going to
Yeah.
be. But hindsight is always 2020.
Yeah, no, I mean that's amazing. Look, I'm conscious of time. I wanted to say look, thank you for like talking us through a lot of this stuff. I'm I'm a giant fan of like conversing with you about pretty much anything. And this stuff is fascinating for me. Whenever I was younger, I always wanted to be able to go to the moon. And that clip that we played, I think at the start, I didn't realize that that was from the end of our time on the moon. Um, I'm wondering if you've got another clip that you'd like to play. I think to play us out.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is Gene Cerman's closing statement from Apollo 17, the same mission that we listened to at the beginning. But it's actually what he said on our way out, and it was his promise to the future, and essentially his challenge to the generations to come.
Houston, before we close out our EVA, probably one of the most significant things we can think about when we think about Apollo is that it has opened for us being the world, a challenge of the future. The door is now cracked, but the promise of that future lies in the young people, not just in America, but the young people all over the world, learning to live and learning to work together. In order to remind all the peoples of the world, in so many countries throughout the world, that this is what we all are striving for in the future. America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon in Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17.
Godspeed indeed. It's been a great episode, and hopefully the viewers have enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you again, Alan, and hopefully we will see you guys next time.
Absolutely. See you later, Jawad.
Bye.